Okay, first of all, before I start, we want to show a video from our last conference in San Francisco, in which we engaged George Shultz and Natan Sharansky. And I met him 2 years before the conference in Jerusalem. And I told them we're going to have a conference of Limmud in San Francisco. He was then 96 years old. And I told you, if you come, I'll bring Sharansky with us. He said, listen, if Sharansky come and I'm alive, we made a deal. and we made a deal. And he came at the age of 98, and Natan came, and the togetherness was an unbelievable experience, which I assume Natan will relate to it. And we'll start now with a short video from the conference of 1 minute of what George Shultz said.
There are lessons that we all can learn from these experiences. And one is the wondrous ability of the human spirit, the individual human being who has views and has beliefs and stands up for them. And then I think we have to recognize the importance of never giving up. Sometimes it seems hopeless. You go and you try and nothing happens, and what can I do? And you sort of say, well, let's go on to something else. No, never give up. Keep trying. Think there are other ways to go about it. Both President Reagan and I and our associates have a great sense of gratitude to the Soviet Jews because they showed us what courage is all about. They showed us how important it is to stand up for what you believe. They showed us how important it is never to give up. If you have something important to work at, don't give up just because it looks hard. Work on it. So that's my message. And my message to the Soviet Jews is thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, some in Australia, some in Israel, some in the former Soviet Union, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova. And thank you to you, all of you, the participants, for being with us today to remember and to honor Secretary of State George Shultz. His personal and professional contribution to the struggle for Soviet Jewry was enormous, and we continue to owe him a great debt. I had the privilege, when I had the Israeli Public Council for Soviet Jewry during those critical years of the 80s, and I had the privilege to see the commitment of the Secretary of Shultz to those issues. In early 88, when he came to Israel to discuss how to advance peace in the Middle East, he made the time. Every time before he came, I got a call to my office, made sure that all the prisoners of Zion that's already in Israel and all those we have to fight for, make a meeting with them. So we made every time a meeting before Sharansky came and after Sharansky came, and that was very, very moving and showed his commitment. And specifically when he went to Russia to meet Gorbachev, and he expressed strongly, he had lists, he had names, and always he made it, and then he reported to us back by his secretary, by the Mr. Pickering, who was then the ambassador to Israel of the United States, and I got a report, and then I reported to the refusenik family and the prison of Zion. It's unbelievable, the Secretary of State dealing with the peace in the world and taking this very issue like his personal issue. And as I told you, when I met him in Israel 4 years ago, I saw his commitment. I showed him a picture which we had with all the prisoners of Zion and some refuseniks, which took place in Hilton, Israel. And he took the picture with him back to his office in San Francisco. I want to end up by saying that such a commitment of American Secretary of State like George Shultz that have an impact on the opening of the gate like nobody has had. And as you could see from here, in the meeting with Sharansky at our conference, show he had a great, great love for Israel, love for the Jews, love for humanity. I would like now to open our special honorary Zoom Shiva, we call, to introduce Matthew Brofman. That not need introduction, but Matthew also is the heir of Edgar Bronfman, that he met Gorbachev, the president of the World Jewish Congress, and had a real impact on influence that the gates were open. So without further ado, Matthew Brofman, the president of Limmud FSU, please.
Thank you, Chaim, and thank you everybody for joining today. And I look around the screen and I see so many faces who were intimately involved in the struggle for Soviet Jewry, and some of you are older than I am, and we're really on the front lines. So I don't want to take up too much time. I really want to thank you all for being here today to honor Secretary Shultz. We do owe him a big debt of gratitude for his tireless commitment in word and in deed, both to ensuring that the USSR allows Soviet Jews to immigrate. Secretary Shultz promised the Jewish community that he would raise the issue of Soviet Jewry with the Soviet authorities each and every time he or a member of his team met with them. And he kept that promise. He never let the Soviet authorities forget that for the US government, for him, for President Reagan, the question of Soviet Jewry was a very real issue. And the successive US administrations would find it unacceptable that Jews could not live free lives in the USSR, nor that they could emigrate. In remembering and honoring Secretary Shultz today, I also, of course, remember the tireless work of my dad, Edgar Bronfman, may he rest in peace. For it was under President Reagan and Secretary Shultz that he visited Moscow as president of the WJC in 1985 and met with Gorbachev, and they discussed, among other issues, the Soviet Jewish airlift. My father went to Moscow again 18 months later in March of '87, and he pressured the authorities to free prisoners from Zion, from prison, from labor camps, from internal exile. And he did everything he could to pressure the Soviet authorities to allow refuseniks to emigrate. He advocated for the right of Soviet Jews to live free Jewish lives, to practice their religion, to teach their children. I had the privilege of traveling with him in 1990, when not only did he meet with President Gorbachev, as I mentioned at my dad's memorial, but he actually interrupted the Soviet leader to bring up this issue of Soviet immigration, the Jewish immigration. It's been said that rather than getting angry at my father for literally putting up his hand and interrupting him, he looked at him with a little bit of newfound respect. And it was one of those moments that, with many of you who were on the front lines, helped the process that ultimately ended with the freeing of Soviet Jews. But my father could have done none of what he did in the 80s without the absolute blessing and support of President Reagan and Secretary Shultz. And Secretary Shultz played a central role in all of this. He cared personally and passionately, as you just saw in that video. He felt that the Jews needed to live free lives, and they should be able to live and practice their religion wherever they wanted to be. And that is why we were able to honor him at our conference in San Francisco in 2017, and why we're honoring his memory today. So the role model we saw in George Shultz was inspirational, and we were privileged to see his commitment to Soviet Jewry while serving as Secretary of State. And we at Limmud FSU are determined that future generations know of his contribution and everything he did to help Soviet Jews. And again, thank you all for being here today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Matthew. I would like now to introduce somebody which no need introduction, our hero, Natan Sharansky. And I can only say that George Shultz loved Natan Sharansky, and he showed it publicly. Natan, bakasha.
Well, I think George Shultz first loved Avital Sharansky, my wife. And he didn't make it a secret. And by the way, he also loved very much Ida Nudel and many refuseniks. He not only knew by name, he was asking what's happened with them after this meeting or after that conversation and so on. I have to say about George Shultz, what is so interesting, you know, well, I see here the real generals of our movement, Malcolm Holland and Mark Levin, and probably there are many others, but they know, at least as good as I know, that they were always grassroots. They were people for whom personal stories were very important. They were having twinning bar mitzvahs in their synagogue. They were coming to these people. They were cherishing every moment of their life that they can share with the refugees. And they were Jewish leaders or heads of organizations who were dealing with the list of refugees and made sure that this list will go to the senators. And there were senators and congressmen who had to ask Soviet authorities about this list. And there were, of course, presidents and prime ministers who had to deal with the power policy of their summits, and they had to make sure that this list of refugees also will be part of it. What's interesting about George Shultz, he was at the top of this policy, choosing between elements of real politic, pragmatic interests and moral questions. But at the same time, he was like these activists who personally knows these people, who wants to share their stories, who wants to live their lives, who is so sympathetic. It was really unbelievable. I have to say that when I came to Israel, it was very dramatic day, which started in Soviet prison, finished, was continued when I met my wife after 12 years in Berlin, and then finished in Ben Gurion Airport, and near the continent, Ben Gurion Airport. Of course, the first one who met me was Chaim Chesler, and then Prime Minister of Israel, the others. And then in the middle of this, and I was so overwhelmed, I think maybe it's all a dream, and they'll wake up back in the Parshat. So I'm told by Shimon Peres that now I'll speak to President Reagan. Well, I didn't know him, but he said he was very important in all this struggle. And then after we finished, and he said, and now you have to speak with George Shultz. I thought, why isn't conversation with President Reagan not enough in such a day? And then Natan told me, no, he was very, very helpful to us. And then how helpful I found out later. I found some very moving stories. Charlie Hill, it was like the shadow of George Shultz, his assistant whom nobody saw. After Avital came 2 or 3 times to the State Department, George Shultz said, how often we can make her to travel like this. You, Charlie, will be perfectly responsible for our communication. So his room was her room, and his communication was also her lines of communication. And then in Geneva, there was such an episode that there was a summit, before summit between Reagan and Gorbachev, there was a meeting between George Shultz and Gromyko, foreign ministers, and also with a lot of publicity around it. And one of the people from Shultz delegation, in fact, today it's not, it was Richard Perl, who was representing State Department, Pentagon, but he was also connecting between Pentagon and State Department. And he helped to Avital to enter the press room just a few minutes before American delegation had to start official press briefing. And she grabbed the microphone and gave her press briefing and told the world about the situation with Soviet Jewry. And the one who was responsible for this from American delegation, I will not give his name, he was absolutely furious. Next morning, there was a meeting of Shultz with all the delegation, and this person said, Russians believe that that was deliberate provocation against them. They are deeply insulted. I demand, first of all, to find out who from our delegation helped her, and second, she has to be distanced, taken away, exiled from this meeting, because otherwise we will not, we will have big problem with the Russians. And Richard thinks, my God, now they'll start all this investigation. George Shultz says, don't touch this woman, don't make any interrogations, don't stop her. I want that if I'll be ever in trouble, my wife will do the same for me. And each of you should also think about the situation of Soviet Jews and and how we have to do everything to help. And that was George Shultz. And I can remind also from my experience with him that when we were preparing this, this big demonstration in Washington, and there are some of the people who were heavily involved in this, but there were discussions for more than a year, from the idea of demonstration, then the visit of Gorbachev was postponed, and it was summit in Iceland. So it came more than a year later, and there was a lot of doubts whether we Jews should undermine the atmosphere of detente or friendship by our demonstration. And then, and George Shultz, by the way, in San Francisco reminded this episode. When Maurice Abrams came to him to say, do you really want this demonstration? Because I was pushing all the time, that I know from Reagan, they want this demonstration. He came and said, do you really want to do this demonstration? George Shultz said, not only I want this demonstration, I want that when Gorbachev comes, at every screen, on every TV, he will see only one thing, how you are demanding to let Soviet Jews go. We need it. You know, for him, there was no question. It was not only a question of moral principle, not only of his personal sympathy to all these refusing that he really lived their lives, but it was a question of high politics. Do we really want to deal with the Soviet Union, which is keeping people behind the Iron Curtain, or do we want to help to break this Iron Curtain? So this connection between very serious politicians, it's the one for whom it is very important to know what academy thinks, what business people think, of course, what diplomats think, what are the interests of different countries involved. But at the same time, the person like activist, like the one who is personally connected to the stories of these people, living these stories and feeling with all his heart that it is his moral obligation to help to them. No doubt that it is people like President Reagan and George Shultz who really changed the attitude of the world to our struggle. And no doubt that we, millions of Soviet Jews who became free, and in fact, all the world became much better place after this, or a lot such giants like George Shultz. And thank you, Chaim, for really forcing me to come to San Francisco. I didn't want to sleep all over the world only for a few minutes with the George Shultz, and then I found, oh my God, it was such a mitzvah to have an opportunity to say to this person who was 97 years old, who remembered every episode better than I remembered, and whose moral clarity was unbelievable. So thank you, Chaim, for giving me this lifetime opportunity.
Natan, thank you to you for being a model for us, how to fight for freedom and to fight for your own belief and for your own Judaism. Nobody else does it better than you. Thank you very much. I would like, for those Russian speaking in Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, and Moscow and Russia, you have interpretation, you have a globus, you press on it and it's said Russian. Then you get the interpretation into Russian. Listen, it's very, very moving that in this very Zoom, really we have those which still alive, and I wish them 120 years old, the leader of the struggle for Soviet Jewry, like Natan said about the Washington big demonstration and all the struggle for Soviet Jewry. The first one to speak is Malcolm, also a model for us to copy. Malcolm, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for doing this and everyone who participated, but also it's very important for us to show the Hakaras HaTov, the recognition of the good that George Shultz did throughout his lifetime, often not appreciated, certainly not until his later years. It's impossible to do justice to someone like George Shultz, professor, doctor, secretary, who contributed so much, and to do it in a brief way doesn't do justice to him. He was a unique leader in so many ways. This multifaceted professional whose life was matched by his exemplary diplomatic service. He was one of only 2 people to hold 4 cabinet positions and who served as an advisor to many presidents. I must admit here that when he was first proposed and the word came to us that he was likely to be the next Secretary of State, we were deeply concerned. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan heard that we were concerned that he was the president of Bechtel, a friend of Saudi Arabia, on the finance committee of Pete McCloskey, Congressman Pete McCloskey. And he said, I understand your concerns, but that does not define George Shultz. And he urged us to talk to him and arranged a phone call in which I spoke to this future Secretary of State. And he was very open and welcoming and understood the concerns that we had suggested. And from that modest start, and thanks also to his special fondness for Conference Chairman Morris Abram, it grew constantly to the point that he did not make a trip to the Middle East or to Russia without calling us before, often during, even from Damascus, and almost always meeting with us afterwards. He shared his findings and vision, knowing the confidence would be respected, and he encouraged our feedback, even welcomed it. He spoke at conference events in Washington, New York, and even when our mission in Israel coincided with his visit to Jerusalem, he came and spoke to us. He felt a special bond to the American Jewish community. Everyone could sense his humility, his integrity, his deep concern, and the sincerity of his views. His commitment and support for Israel had its beginnings with the death of a brilliant graduate student of his at Princeton who returned to Israel to join in the Six-Day War and was killed in action. Shultz wondered, what kind of country is this that a young person would give up his career and his future in order to go back and fight for it? Shultz's interest and affection for Israel grew consistently as he called his visits to Israel, quote, like coming home. This despite his frustration that his multiple efforts to achieve peace did not succeed, although he got Arafat to recognize Israel. Yet despite this, he laid the groundwork for the special U.S.-Israel relationship of today. He acknowledged that he saw in Israel the qualities he valued so much in America. He never sought credit or tribute, but in keeping with Pirkei Avot, that the more you avoid honor, the more it chases you, there is a universal recognition and admiration of his personal and professional qualities. Trust was his hallmark. And even as late as recent weeks, he said trust is the coin of the realm as he bemoaned the acrimony in American politics and society. When a very sensitive issue arose regarding Israel during his tenure that others would have grandstanded, he sought quiet resolution. He called me once to come immediately to Washington, which I did. He told me that a new congressional measure created a potential crisis in U.S.-Israel relationships. I flew to Israel that night, met the Prime Minister, and out of his respect for Shultz, he complied immediately, and the crisis was diffused quietly and promptly. As tough as he could be in seeking objectives, especially vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, human rights, and other concerns, he alone could bring about the first nuclear reduction treaty, and he was a big factor in the dissolution of the USSR. His famous Seder and admonitions to Soviet leaders about human rights and the rights of Soviet Jews in particular are well recorded, but nothing touched him more than the personal contact, whether it was with Natan and especially with Eden Udell, whose story he told 1,000 times, her phone call to him that I am home, as well as countless others. When the Russians banned me for almost 25 years after arresting me and my wife and I in Kishinev, because we were there to monitor a trial of one of the refuseniks, Shultz quietly put my name on his official delegation to Moscow. At the last minute, the Russians caught on and threatened to cancel the trip. Shultz had a very good laugh and enjoyed tweaking them. At the recent Limmud conference that was mentioned, he didn't say how important it is to stand up for what you believe and never give up. The lesson of Soviet Jews for everyone. George Shultz never gave up, and we are indeed indebted to him forever.
Thank you, Malcolm. We really, all our people, really thank you for your great service to the Jewish people, to the American Jewry, first of all, heading the New York Action for Soviet Jewry, and the Conference of Presidents for the last how many years, God knows, and that will never be forgotten, and we thank you.
I hope God knows. Yeah.
Now I want to introduce another giant leader of the struggle for Soviet Jewry, a great American leader, David Harris. Please, David.
Thank you to Limmud FSU. Thank you to my dear friend Matthew Bronfman and to everyone on this call. I confess that I grew up in a home which was very suspicious of secretaries of state. My parents were both Holocaust survivors who were trapped in Europe, and the US State Department was not friendly to them and others like them. It took George Shultz to really change my mind fundamentally and irreversibly. Although just like Malcolm Hoenlein, my dear friend of so many years, when George Shultz was first nominated, the Bechtel connection loomed large. Was he in fact going to be a friend of the Jewish people in the state of Israel, or was he going to be a captive of Arab interests, which were reflected by Bechtel's construction contracts? It didn't take us long to find out the answer, that George Shultz was going to be a friend, a true friend, to the point where if we were to fast forward, if I can borrow from Lermontov, we could say that he became Герой нашего времени, Герой еврейского народа, a hero of our time and a hero of the Jewish people. I too had the opportunity to meet with George Shultz, the Secretary of State, during those years. And I too had the opportunity to observe his extraordinary understanding and commitment. I think he once said very famously that it's amazing how much you can achieve as Secretary of State if you're willing to give credit to others. And George Shultz was an unusually humble and modest man. But George Shultz was the man for the time. Indeed, none other than Henry Kissinger once said rather famously that if I had to rely on one American, just one American to defend this country in a time of crisis, it would be George Shultz. And we, the Jewish people, the state of Israel, friends of human rights, were extraordinarily fortunate that George Shultz was by the side of Ronald Reagan during the most critical decade of the post-war years, the 1980s. And as has been said, not only did he stand by Israel and the US-Israel relationship, which he did, and not only did he stand by Natan Sharansky and Ida Nudel and all the Jews of the Soviet Union as he did, but he, together with Ronald Reagan, presided over what became the fall of the Soviet Union. And of all the Russian words that I know, my favorite word of all in this case is the word bывший, as in bывший Sovietsky Soyuz, the former Soviet Union. And not enough credit is given. In fact, today it seems like ancient history. But George Shultz was a diplomat's diplomat, a statesman's statesman, an activist's activist, and a humanist's humanist. And yes, it was George Shultz who carried those lists with him. And it was George Shultz who in Moscow attended the Seder, indeed asked that the Seder be organized with Soviet Jews, right under the shadow of the Kremlin. And I'm not sure that he knew the Russian words "Отпусти народ мой" or the Hebrew word "Shelach et ami," but he certainly understood the theme of Passover, "Let my people go." And that was his message relentlessly to the Soviet authorities, beginning in 1985 with Mikhail Gorbachev, a more responsive Soviet authority than those who preceded him. So yes, we owe him an enormous debt of gratitude. In 2009, I had a historic opportunity, something I will never forget. The public broadcasting system, PBS, was going to do an hour-long documentary of a conversation between Mikhail Gorbachev and George Shultz, which was conducted in person at the Rainbow Room in Rockefeller Center. And I was asked to introduce the program and to speak before Shultz and Gorbachev came on the stage. But even before that, I sat at the lunch table with both of them. I heard the respect between them. I heard Gorbachev say, when he learned that I had been the organizer, the chief organizer, with many, of course, but the chief organizer of the 1987 rally that Natan Sharansky referenced, he said, I paid attention to that rally. I understood that it wasn't just Jews speaking, it was America speaking. And I understood as well from Gorbachev the respect that he had then and has had since for Shultz, and vice versa. And to be able to be, on the one hand, one of the authors of the end of the Soviet Union And on the other hand, to have the respect of Soviet authorities was not something easy or simple to accomplish. And just this December, 2 months ago, before George Shultz passed away, the American Jewish Committee had a special event in San Francisco. And it was during Hanukkah, and George Shultz participated. And the story is as follows. George Shultz's grandfather was a Protestant clergyman in New York. He had a church to which all were welcome. The Jews in the community were so grateful for this forward-looking, inclusive approach to Christian-Jewish relations that they gave his grandfather a menorah. This December 2020, joining with the American Jewish Committee, George Shultz took out the menorah of his grandfather and lit it in recognition of Hanukkah. That was the man George Shultz was, and that was the man I, for one, will always remember.
Thank you very much, David Harris, a great leader. We've been following your leadership for many years, and your energy is endlessly influencing all of us. Continue to do whatever you do so well. Now, I want just to tell you a small story that relates to George Shultz about his immigration to Ida Noodle. As you know, Limmud is working all over the world, concentrating with youngsters of the former Soviet Union. And we had the Limmud in Kishinev. And I told them, we're not going to leave the Limmud before we go into Benderi to visit the house of Ida Noodle. So we explained to them who Ida Noodle was as prisoner of Zion and her house in the exile. So we went there and we made there a special tefillah. And in this way, this is what we do. We try to do in life what everybody dream about, the courage of the prisoners of Zion and what they left to us to follow. The next speaker is going to be a unique woman, Dorit Golander, former Israeli ambassador to Russia. She herself comes from Benelux, and she's going to speak in Russian. Ambassador Golander, please.
Первым долгом я хочу всех поприветствовать. Меня попросили говорить по-русски, и, конечно, нет для многих присутствующих здесь более близкого языка, чем иврит и русский. Можно было бы говорить и на другом языке. Проработав очень много лет на радио на русском языке в Израиле, наверное, нет ни одного отказника или ни одного человека, который вел борьбу за выезд из Советского Союза в Израиль, который не был бы мне знаком. И тут сидит Эли Валкхе, который может это подтвердить. Мы вместе работали и вели эту борьбу с помощью Соединенных Штатов Америки и с помощью многих стран мира, потому что между Израилем и Россией не было дипломатических отношений. Но, тем не менее, та борьба, которая велась, она навсегда останется в памяти истории и всегда останется в памяти тех людей, которые отдали частицу своей жизни для освобождения евреев и для свободного выезда. Наша сегодняшняя встреча, она, конечно, посвящена особому человеку, Джорджу Шульцу, который в администрации Рейгана был среди голубей, а не ястребов, и активно продвигал идеи президента о ядерном разоружении с Советским Союзом. Однако, в отличие от архитекторов иранской ядерной сделки, Шульц использовал свое влияние для продвижения тем прав человека, особенно в интересах советских евреев. Шульц передал министру иностранных дел тогда Советского Союза Эдуарду Шеварднадзе список отказников. Это больше, чем призыв конкретным людям. Это был знак того, что Америка отказывается рассматривать бедственные отношения и положение евреев как внутреннее советское дело, и что любой прогресс в вопросах, важных для Москвы, должен решаться и должен быть основан на решении еврейского вопроса цивилизованным путем. Шульц сумел полностью мобилизовать Рейгана на эту борьбу. Он вспоминал одну очень важную встречу. Эта встреча была встреча Рейгана с бывшим тогда послом в Вашингтоне Анатолием Добрыниным. Мы были в комнате втроем, Встреча была больше 1,5 часа, вспоминал он. И, конечно же, Рейган был очень в курсе всех дел, он помнил имена, он знал проблемы советских евреев, он был хорошо осведомлен. Он заставил тогда советского посла понять, что, в принципе, это не временное явление, что эта тема никуда не денется, и она будет продолжаться, и она будет на повестке дня. Мы никогда не остановимся, говорил Шульц еврейским активистам. Это он сказал, вы знаете, был такой ужин, который проходил 13 апреля 1987 года. Это было в доме посла Соединенных Штатов Америки в Москве. И тогда было туда приглашено более 50 отказников. Ну, конечно, борьба за советское еврейство шла к победе, и когда она приобрела более реальный, так сказать, реальный вид, это был марш на Вашингтон 6 декабря 1987 года. И я помню, что мы передавали об этом на нашем радио, хотя мы тогда не знали, слышит ли нас Советский Союз, но тем не менее голос Израиля звучал. А в 1990 году операция «Исход» открыла двери массовой репатриации советских евреев. И опять-таки мы никто не можем не вспомнить первый звонок, который сделала Ида Нудель, приехав в Израиль. Она позвонила Джорджу Шульцу и сказала: «Я дома, я в Израиле, спасибо». А у Шульца однажды спросили: ну вот как дипломат, что вы видите самое важное в вашей роли, в вашей работе? Он сказал: если я смог помочь хоть одному человеку, я счастлив, потому что я частицу своей жизни посвятил именно этой борьбе. Но сегодня мы живем в другом мире, мы являемся свидетелями свободного выезда, и поэтому все, что было тогда, а сейчас отмечается 30-летие Большой Алии, я думаю, что это очень правильно сегодня вспомнить Джорджа Шульца. Я хочу поблагодарить, конечно же, и Хайма Чеслера, и господина Бромфмана. И я вижу тут Марка Левина, с которым я встречалась в Москве, и который в свое время тоже активно участвовал в борьбе за освобождение евреев Советского Союза, и Дэвида Харриса, и Малкольма, и всех, которые сегодня причастны к этой передаче. Я думаю, что те времена больше не вернутся. И большое спасибо.
Rabbi, thank you very much. Ambassador, as always, your kind words are very, very touching. Now I would like to introduce Sandra Kab, that did no introduction, my co-partner in Limmud, that's following us for the last 16 years all over the former Soviet Union of the world. Sandra Kab, please.
Thank you, Chaim, and thank you for allowing us to memorialize George Shultz in the way that we're doing it today. It's really inspirational. Many of you know, but many of this call do not know that Limmud FSU has been operating for almost 17 years in 9 countries, and it is a program that connects young Russian Jews wherever they are to our heritage and history. And we saw history in the making in our San Francisco Limmud in 2017. I, for one, have found that I think we had 1,500 young people there, was so inspirational, because many of those young people are the children and grandchildren of the Soviet Jews that George Shultz helped emigrate after the fall of the Soviet Union, and didn't know who he was. And it was so incredible and meaningful to see him reunited with Natan. And we really opened the eyes of the young people that were there. And this quiet, humble man, as Natan said, clear-minded at 97, it was really a thrill, personal thrill for me, and one of the most meaningful events that I've ever attended in all of these close to 17 years. It was George Shultz, actually, who allowed our work of Limmud FSU to continue and flourish to these days. So thank you, Chaim, for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Sandra, and we really want to take you on this forum for your volunteer work for the last 17 years. What an energy. What an energy. Thank you. Now I'm going to introduce Rabbi Julius Bergman. Rabbi Julius Bergman, his problem that he's shy and he's modest is behind the scene, but he's one of the strongest leaders that American Jewry ever introduced. And it was very unique in San Francisco to see the meeting between Rabbi Bergman and George Shultz. The way that Jewry Rabbi Bergman spoke, which he told it was one of his most moving moment on his life. Rabbi Bergman, please. The honorary president of the Claims Conference.
He has to
Mr. Bergman, if you can unmute yourself, you have the permission, Mr. Bergman.
Can you unmute him?
Yes, of course. He just has to accept. Mr. Bergman, can you click OK? Okay.
All right. Maybe he'll do it next.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh,
okay.
There we go.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay.
Yes, we're with you.
Yes, Rabbi Bergman. It's our honor to hear you.
Thank you. Let me say I worked closely with George Shultz when I was chairman of the Conference of Presidents, and he, of course, was the Secretary of State. I recall vividly the call he made to me as he had just returned from a meeting with Andrei Gromyko, the foreign minister of Russia, in Madrid. And he told me that as promised, as you heard before, as promised, he raised the issue of Soviet Jewry with the foreign minister, but unfortunately the response was, it's in effect, it's none of your damn business. It's an internal matter, and it's nothing to do with America or the relationships. And then he turned to me and in effect said, the relationship between Russia and the United States is so frigid that the only place you're going to get any future from is if you relate to Russia through a third world. So I said, what do you mean by that? He said, for example, Indira Gandhi, the third world of India, the third world has a special relationship to Russia and to the United States, but the United States does not in and of itself have that same kind of relationship anymore. Basically what we did, he says you have to go to the third world and talk to them and see if they can help you in terms of the relationship with Russia. Now, of course, we didn't have any relationship, the Americans. The Jews did not have a relationship with the third world. But what we did do is subsequently, we related to the third world through England. The Prime Minister of England at the time was Mrs. Thatcher, and we met with her and others at 10 Downing at her office, and we raised the issue of Russia and Soviet Jewry. She interestingly said, Indira Gandhi has a special problem because the relationship with America is not that good, because America is doing very well in terms of her arch enemy, the military dictatorship of Pakistan, but is not helpful and not being very helpful in terms of India, which she considered a democracy as compared to Pakistan. Be that as it may, nothing came of it. But it just goes to show you the type of person the Secretary of State was. There was another time, since we're talking about the Secretary of State, there's another time when Reagan, under his tutelage, basically was ready to promulgate what they called then the Reagan Peace Initiative. And I got a call from the Secretary of State that the Reagan will be going on television that night, and he's going to announce the initiative, and this is basically what he wants to say. And he gave me some of the talking points, and then said that the initiative is being informed, the State Department, and specifically an ambassador to the UN, to the Israel of the State Department, is going to meet with the Prime Minister of Israel and inform him of what it's going to say. And he wants the Conference of Presidents to meet with him the next day and give our reaction to the initiative. We met, of course. We were going to meet the next day. I think it was like 3 o'clock, and we arranged to meet with ourselves an hour before to see if we can coalesce and get our understandings among the Jews as to what the reaction is, depending upon what will happen that night. Well, anyway, we heard what was the initiative on television that night. I recall a CBS, I think it was, visited me at home and wanted my reaction immediately after the speech. And be that as it may, the next day we all met. That is, the Jewish delegation met. I think it was in the American Jewish Committee offices before we eventually were going to meet with George Shultz to see if we can get an agreement among ourselves what our position was going to be. And we finally did have that session agreement. We met with George Shultz and told him our unanimous position as to what that position, as to what the that the proposal by President Reagan will not be conducive to a peace plan. And sure enough, when we met with the George Shultz, we told him that, and then he went around the table, which he does repeatedly whenever he meets with us. And that happened. That's what happened at that time. And in general, as a lot of people said already today on this call, whenever you met with Shultz, he was the sweetest and kindest person in the world, as soft-spoken as possible, and yet you knew he had the big stick. He represented the not only the Secretary of State, but he had the right hand of the president, and he was extremely powerful, although as modest as heck. And we really owe a great gratitude to everything that he did throughout his years, including all the way to a month or two before his passing. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Bergman. We want to take this forum and to thank you very much for your lifelong service for the Jewish people, with all your major leadership in different organizations, you led, and I have been serving, knowing you for the last 20 years as the chairman of the Claims Conference. Wish your honesty and your ability to combine all the different figures and different organizations together. This is for you credit. We wish you lifelong עד 120. תודה רבה. Now we have a special message from the chairman of the Jewish Agency, Yitzhak Herzog.
Dear friends, we are gathered here under the realm of Limmud FSU and its leadership to honor the memory of a great American leader and statesman, George Shultz, the former Secretary of State of the United States of America under the presidency of Ronald Reagan. My late father, Chaim Herzog, served in those years as the President of the State of Israel, and he held the first ever state visit of an Israeli president in the United States. He was received as he landed in Andrews Airport by Secretary of State George Shultz, and from then on, they became very close friends. My father, in his memoirs, Living History, depicts vividly his interaction with George Shultz. For example, he mentions that as the visit was in November 1987, George Shultz alerted him as to the possibility of an eruption of an intifada in the Palestinian territories, indeed an intifada which broke out a month later in December 1987. George Shultz, together of course with President Ronald Reagan, led the world to the collapse of the Iron Curtain. And indeed, his wisdom, his understanding of the intricacies of the world led to a very responsible change. So much so that when my father met with Mikhail Gorbachev a few years later, he told him that the world owes huge debt to the team Reagan-Shultz, because that team was so close to each other and operated so beautifully in managing the world, in leading the world. George Shultz was a great, staunch friend of Israel. My father writes in his memoirs that George Shultz was a sworn Mushba, Yadid Mushba, a sworn friend of Israel, not only a friend. And indeed, whilst he had his differences with the Israeli government, he always took the line that cared for Israel's well-being, safety, and security. And so, it's not surprising that after he retired, he assumed the leadership of the Israel Democracy Institute as a lay leader, caring so much about Israeli democracy, voicing his opinion. George Shultz, whilst being, of course, a proud Republican, was a great defender of the American Constitution and the democratic spirit of the United States. I'm sure he would have taken deeply to heart the scenes of January 6th on the Capitol Hill. Yet, he was a true believer in American democracy, in its role as world leader, and as such left a huge legacy that must be honored and remembered. We, the Jewish people, will always remember his staunch support for the Jewish people, for their plight, whether it be in the former Soviet Union or in Ethiopia, as well as his support of the State of Israel. And we are grateful for that support. It will always be remembered. May his memory be a blessing. And may all of us remember his legacy and continue his legacy as part of a worldwide legacy that agrees, respects the independence of the State of Israel, its right to exist, its interests of security, as well as its involvement in the region and the plight towards peace. May his memory be a blessing. Yehi zichro baruch.
Thank you, the chairman of the Jewish Agency, Isaac Herzog, for his really meaningful words. And now I would like to call upon a friend of mine, the partner from the Public Council for Soviet Jewry, the Public Council in America, and there's no one else to better introduce him than Mark Levin. Please, Mark.
Thank you very much. I want to join in thanking Limmud FSU. for organizing this tribute to George Shultz. This is a very special day for me for a couple of reasons. One, it's the end of the 30-day memorial on the death of my mother, and to be able to also be a part of this tribute is very touching for me. George Shultz is one of my heroes. I don't say was because he continues to be. I had the opportunity, thanks to my organization, but in particular Morris Abram, to learn so much from someone of such stature as George Shultz. There were many opportunities for NCSEJ to meet with Secretary Shultz during his tenure, during his time as Secretary of State. And for me, it was my own personal postgraduate seminar, being able to be in meetings with the Secretary of State and then Chairman of NCSEJ, Morris Abram. There was a true bond that existed between these two incredible individuals. Secretary Shultz was one of the most self-assured, forthright, honest, committed public officials I've ever met. And in a minute, I'll talk about something that most people didn't realize. He had a very good sense of humor. You've heard, I don't want to repeat what my colleagues have already talked about, but there are a few important points that need to be emphasized over and over again. And one of these is that George Shultz did something within the State Department that hadn't really been done before on behalf of Soviet Jews or working with the organized American Jewish community. He sent a signal from the top to the very bottom that this issue was one of 4 areas that would always be on any agenda between American and Soviet officials. And it was a message that was transmitted, whether it was from the deputy secretary down to the desk officer on the then Soviet desk, that this issue was vital, was mandatory to be a part of the agenda. And if for no other reason, this was a message that was coming not only from the Secretary of State, but from the President of the United States. And it was something that actually happened. I can't tell all of you how many times, whether we were meeting, as I said, with the Soviet desk or a deputy assistant secretary or with other officials, where it was very clear that they understood the commitment to Soviet Jews from the Secretary of State in particular, but as importantly from the United States of America. He empowered his staff in a way that no other Secretary of State had done before, and I'm not sure since. From the very first meeting that we had with Secretary Shultz, it was clear how strong a commitment he felt toward the freeing of Soviet Jews. In the very first meeting, when one of our lay leaders said that he understood that linkage couldn't be made on an issue as important as arms control, Secretary Shultz cut him off and said, "Why not?" He said, "It's our intention to link the freeing of Soviet Jews at every opportunity." Now, we may not always agree on how best to link the issue, but rest assured that this issue is of the utmost importance. And I think you can see, and we've heard how he carried this out over his 6.5 years as Secretary of State. He also, and I think Natan may remember this, but I don't know if it was before, I think it was before the rally in 1987, the Soviets freed a large number of refuseniks and prisoners of Zion, and they gathered in Washington, and the secretary hosted them. And it was one of many meetings that he had with refuseniks, former refuseniks, whether in Washington, Moscow, or even in Israel. You know, I could go on and on and on about his significance and what he meant to our community and the importance. But I mentioned his sense of humor. In 1984, at our annual policy conference, Secretary Shultz was keynote speaker, but there was a bit of controversy because we also invited the well-known American actress Jane Fonda to speak, because Jane Fonda took a particular interest in the case of Ida Nudell. And I say controversial because there were many, I won't say many, there were some people in our community and elsewhere who thought it was inappropriate to have Jane Fonda on the same program as the Secretary of State. And of course, you know, we raised this issue with his staff, but more importantly, it was raised with the Secretary himself. And with a twinkle in his eye and a smile on his face, he said, "Who wouldn't want to meet Jane Fonda?" And that put the end to the controversy. You know, I wanted to always have an opportunity to say thank you to him after he served as Secretary of State. And I did have that opportunity when I flew out to San Francisco to meet with our supporters. And this was a few years ago. And I made a trip to Palo Alto. And, you know, I wanted really just to say thank you one more time. And what was interesting is that we reminisced for a few minutes, but he really didn't want to reminisce. This was a man of the moment. This was a person who was as concerned about what was happening in today's world as he was when he was Secretary of State. And probably spent the bulk of the hour that I spent with him talking about current events. And at the end, I said to Mr. Secretary, I know I've said it before, but I want to say it one more time. Thank you for everything that you've done on behalf of Soviet Jews and the American Jewish community and the state of Israel. And he looked at me and said, no, Mark, it's I who owe all of you thanks. So Chaim, I'll stop there.
Mark. Very moving remark. And thank you for your long serving our people in the United States and elsewhere, the good work that you do. Now I would like to ask Sasha Cholomyansky, President of Zion, and a modest man, an educator, and which did a lot when he was in the former Soviet Union, but he did a lot while he's in Israel. You probably will hear it from him. He will speak in Russian, and can you please put the interpretation?
I think I will speak in English. I will speak English.
Okay, go ahead.
I will learn English on the fly. So I wouldn't venture to describe the greatness of a statement Mr. George Shultz had been done before me. I will just briefly describe our meeting and the personal note. After my release from the prison in '86, several influential Jewish organizations, prominent British historians, Sir Martin Gilbert, started working to secure an immigration permit for our family. And they approached Mr. Shultz, and he raised this issue vis-a-vis his Soviet counterpart, Edward Shevardnadze. When they met in 1987 on April, Shevardnadze told Shultz that our problem, problem of our family, has been resolved. And we got a similar message from the office of Senator Kennedy and from the leadership of International Conference on Soviet Jewry. But actually, we received yet another refusal. So the promise of the Soviet foreign minister appears to mean little. In July 1987, Martin Gilbert sent additional letter to Mr. Shultz advocating our case. I actually met with George Shultz during the major reception at the United States Embassy in the fall of 1987. It was not at all the type of a person I would expect to meet. He was rumored to be a thoughtful, reserved, somewhat cold, analytical type of a person, the type perfectly matching the image of the Secretary of State. I was surprised that Mr. Shultz remembered the details of my case and about the unkept promise of Mr. Shevardnadze. Mr. Shultz was attentive to details, eager to learn more, and promised us to continue to promote our case along with the overall issue of the Soviet Jewry. We really felt something impressive about him. It was far more than a mere formality. He meant what he promised. George Shultz radiated unusual warmth and cordiality. One could hardly expect to find such features in the high-ranking official nature overburdened with international affairs. Encouraged by Mr. Shultz, our family staged a protest demonstration in front of the Soviet Foreign Ministry in Moscow. We wrote out the words, "Mr. Shevardnadze, keep your promise," on the posters. Immediately, a police officer and 10 KGB men in civilian clothes pounced on us. The KGB men surrounded us on all sides, teared away the posters, yelled insults, and waved their hands in our face. But this time I was not arrested. And in several months, we finally obtained the long-awaited permission to emigrate. And the question, the time has changed and people can freely leave the former USSR and now Russia. And the question is asked if it is relevant, or it's just bygone and let bygone be bygone. I would believe that it is highly relevant now. First, we have won. It was a clear case victory over the forces of evil, over mighty forces of evil. And this victory opened the door to the unprecedented Jewish exodus on a scale unheard since ancient Egypt. Do people thank the Secretary of State? I think we do. We owe him a debt of gratitude. His devotion to the good deeds earned him an admirable place in history. I think this gratitude has to be clearly articulated. It is especially important now when the accomplishment of the saga of the Soviet Jewry fade away, and the new generation knows little to nothing about these historical events. And maybe a couple of things that we learned from this story. The moral case overrides all other considerations. Sometimes it's important to rise up to the occasion and not to delve into a cold calculation of chances to succeed. The real politics is at times short-sighted, and unity can work wonders. Thank you, Secretary Shultz. Thank you. Thank you.
תודה רבה, סשה חולומיאנסקי, for your nice word. It was very moving. We are really reaching the end very soon. I would like to introduce Ambassador Eli Valk, who is ambassador to Belarus. He for many, many years worked in לשכת הקשר, נתיב, and he helped us for the struggle for Soviet Jewry. Eli, בבקשה.
Thank you. And I don't think I have a lot of memories of contacts with George Shultz, but I can just tell you that לשכת הקשר נתיב was in very close contact with the National Conference on Soviet Jewry in New York and in Washington department. And a lot of our materials were sent over to the State Department. I can remember also one year when I served as a Soviet Jewry Research Bureau director. It was in 1980, being stationed in New York. And then State Department, it was not the years when Shultz was the Secretary of State, but just what I remember, the close contacts with State Department, which helped us to forward our memos and profiles of refuseniks and of prisoners of Zion to the Congress. And those documents were introduced as a matter, as a minutes of sessions of Congress. But I do know that at the period of starting of perestroika and the new waves in Soviet Union, 1987, we corresponded very, very often with George Shultz. Not myself personally, but we have a special department in Lishkat HaKesher and the Nativ, who was people of this department were in touch both with the USA embassy in Tel Aviv and with the headquarters in Washington. Therefore, I will just repeat what I wrote in chat. I thank Chaim Chesler for this opportunity to pay tribute to such an important and prominent state leader like George Shultz. And on my personal opinion, personal feelings, I thank you, Chaim, for gathering the people who I know from the past, and it's a pleasure to see all of them, anyone who spoke and will be speaking here. I'm just greeting you, all of you, and thank that we keep in touch on the matter of Soviet Jewry. By the way, recently there was a conference on Soviet Jewry matter. It was devoted to the 50th anniversary of the first Leningrad trial. This was held in English, and later on 2 such conferences were held in Russian. I think that the motto of that Zoom meetings is important also for everyone who attend today this Zoom gathering. The motto was, we have to keep our memories, and we have to transfer all this heritage to the young generation of Jews, wherever they are, in the United States or in Israel, especially in Israel, because people don't know don't remember. There is a new generation who don't know, let my people go, shalach et ami, and they're just taking for granted that there was more, about 1 million Jews arrived from Soviet Union. But we think that people, and especially youth, should know. And I think that everyone who is sitting here can also contribute to this noble aim. Thank you,
Rabbi, Ambassador Eli Valk, and thank you for Nativ, Lishkat HaKesher, for his enormous work for so many years. That had a great success of opening the gate. Now I'm going to call upon what I call myself Golda, Silva Zalmanson. She's the Golda of the prisoners of Zion, a very shy person, but a great and brave woman. Silva, בבקשה.
כן. תודה רבה, ואני...
Speak in Russian.
תודה רבה, אמרתי. כן. Too many languages. No, I will speak in Russian. It's easier still. Я была одним из участников Ленинградского суда, знаменитого Ленинградского суда в угоне самолета. И в эти дни мы прощаемся с большим другом советских евреев, которые боролись за право свободно покинуть СССР и жить в Израиле. Поддержка американских лидеров придавала вдохновение и силы противостоять и поддерживать надежду на победу узников Сиона, которые были приговорены к многолетнему заключению суровых условиях советских лагерей и тюрем. Наша благодарность и восхищение одним из величайших и благороднейших американских лидеров Джордж Шульц навсегда останутся в наших сердцах. Его слова о важности человеческого духа и стремлении никогда не сдаваться запомнились мне. Иногда это кажется безнадежным, но никогда не сдавайся, продолжай бороться. Да будет благословенна его память на вечные времена. Спасибо вам за этот прекрасно организованный вечер, Zoom, и всех участников в этом движении свободы за иммиграцию, свобода евреев выбрать себе тот путь, который уготован нам на будущее. Мы живем в стране, с которым нас связывает общее прошлое и желание жить вместе в будущем. И спасибо всем, кто участвовал в этом, и тем, кто дал нам вот это право продолжать и оставаться вот такими, какими есть, евреями, свободными евреями в свободной стране. Будь благословенна память Джорджа Шульца на вечные времена.
תודה רבה, סילבה. We are very moved by your word. אנחנו מאוד התרגשנו מדברייך, ולחיים ארוכים. We are told to the last one. We're going to hear Professor Deborah Lipstadt, and then we're going to show a short movie, what we call the wedding operation of the life of Sylvia Salmonson. So, Professor Lipstadt.
It's a pleasure being with you. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. Work things have intervened. But I just wanted to share with you one anecdote about George Shultz, who was a great man, and you don't need to be told that. You're here this morning to celebrate his life. When he finished his tenure in office, he was interviewed, I believe it was by the Los Angeles Times, as he was packing up his office. And they asked him, what was the highlight of your time in office? Tell us some of the highlights. And one would think that he would have spoken about a great treaty that he had achieved, a great international commitment or something like that. He said, no. It was when I received a phone call from Ida Nudel. Ida Nudel had just been released from the Soviet Union. He had met Ida Nudel. She had attended the famous Seder he gave at the embassy. And he asked Ida, where are you? And Nudel said, I'm home, I'm in Israel. That is what he told the press was a highlight of his tenure. It gives you not so much, or in part, it gives you a measure of the man, but it gives you also a measure of how important this issue was for him. I feel privileged to have met him. I met him a number of times, most recently at the Limmud FSU in San Francisco when he had that great reunion with Natan Sharansky. We are privileged to have been touched by him. Thank you.
Before we will show the movie, I want to thank our executive director of Limmud, Natasha Chechik, and her Debbie Lipson, that used to work with me in the Public Council for Soviet Jewry, organizing Sharansky arrival in the Lod Airport. Until now, she is with us working. I want to thank you, Matthew, for helping us putting it together, and to Sandra, and particularly to all of you. From Natan, I cannot mention on the name, but Natan will represent all of us. All the leaders of American Jewry, all the Israelis, they worked so hard and we made it happen. And before let my people go, now let people educated to remain Jewish and to be proud of it. Toda Rabba, thank you very much for you all. In the memory of George Shultz, now we show the movie.
gentlemen, I'm sure that you all agree that this is a very emotional moment for all of us. If there's any one person that symbolizes what we have all been fighting for, freedom for Soviet Jewry, it's Silva Zalmas.
אני עמדתי שם על הבמה, חופשייה, אבל לא יכולתי להרגיש מאושרת. בעלי עדיין בכלא, האחים שלי עדיין בכלא, והחברים שלי עדיין בכלא. הרגשתי אשמה שאני בחוץ, כמו ריקה, שעזבתי אותם ולא חולקת את גורלם.
Натурально 2 года исполнилось, как ты откинулась от хозяина. Ты, конечно, помнишь, что нам с тобой нашептывали о 2 годах как максимум разлуки. Тогда это казалось нам слишком долгим. 2 года. Теперь остается только посмеяться над собой. Горько посмеяться. Дни вдруг стали томительно длинными. Тебе в этом смысле повезло, раз и в дамке. Но при всем том, надежда – это здорово, жизнью запахло.
ביותר משבועיים שוכבת סילבה זלמנסון כאן ליד כותל ישעיהו מול בניין האו"ם בניו יורק. היא שובתת שביתת רעב עד שייתנו לה להתראות עם בעלה אדוארד קוזניצוב היושב בבית הסוהר בברית המועצות, או עד שישחררו אותו ויאפשרו לו לצאת לישראל. תחילה חשבה סילבה שדעת הקהל כאן בארצות הברית יחד עם רבבות החתימות שנצטברו ישפיעו על הסובייטים לאפשר לה להתראות עם בעלה. היום ביום ה-15 לשביתת הרעב היא כמעט מיואשת.
אני ממשיכה בגלל שאני חשבתי להשיג את המטרה שלי, ואני חשבתי שכך אני אוכל לקבל את הפגישה יותר מהר. עכשיו אני לא יודעת, הם לא ענו.
The Soviet did not respond, but thousands of New Yorkers came to speak to my mother and encourage her. There were also ministers, senators, congressmen, and even members of the various delegations to the United Nations. She lost consciousness after 16 days and was hospitalized. Immediately after my mother's release from the hospital, she continued her struggle for many more years to come.
Carried not signs of protest, but signs of thanks and welcome. They were expressing joy at yesterday's release of 5 Soviet dissidents flown to this country in exchange for 2 Soviet spies.
Reaction to Operation Wedding created the first crack in the Iron Curtain, which enabled almost 400,000 people to get exit visas in the 1970s. In the 20 years before that, less than 11,000 people were allowed to leave the Soviet Union.
Okay, thank you very much, all of you. Thank you, Sylvia. You show us the sample and we all follow. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chaim. Thank you, all of you. And remembering George.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye. Shalom.
Thank you.
Shalom.
Bye. Друзья, огромное спасибо. До свидания.
спасибо вам.
Спасибо.
תודה, סילביה, היה מרגש מאוד.